The comparison between Wade Wilson and John Wayne Gacy reveals two starkly different criminal profiles. While both men were responsible for heinous acts, their approaches to murder, manipulation, and their psychological motivations diverged greatly. Gacy was a calculated sociopath who manipulated his community and tortured his victims, whereas Wilson's crimes were more impulsive and driven by short bursts of anger. This analysis explores the methods, mindsets, and public perceptions of these two notorious criminals, illustrating how their different backgrounds shape their violent paths. Wade Wilson and John Wayne Gacy, while both notorious for their horrific crimes, displayed stark differences in their methods and interactions with victims. Gacy was infamous for luring young men and boys to his home under the guise of job opportunities or social gatherings, often manipulating his victims by posing as a trusted figure within the community. On the other hand, Wade Wilson's approach to his victims leaned more on direct violence, with less focus on manipulation and more on impulsive, brutal force. The modus operandi of Gacy was significantly more calculated. He maintained a facade of normalcy as a community figure, often dressing as a clown for children's parties, which earned him the nickname the Killer Clown. Gacy's ability to charm and deceive his victims led to his horrific acts of confinement, torture, and murder in his own home. In contrast, Wilson lacked such pretense. His attacks were overtly aggressive, leaving a clear and immediate sense of danger in his wake. Gacy's murders involved a series of rituals that included handcuffing, strangulation, and burying his victims in the crawl space of his house. These calculated steps showed Gacy's level of organization and a cold, detached demeanor. Wilson, while equally violent, showed less premeditation in his acts, suggesting a more reactive or emotionally driven approach to violence. While Gacy took his time with each victim, Wilson's killings were often rapid and chaotic, reflecting his disorganized psyche. Another critical difference lies in the way both men handled the aftermath of their crimes. Gacy went to great lengths to conceal the bodies of his victims, entombing them under his house, which allowed him to continue his killing spree for years without detection. In contrast, Wilson demonstrated less concern for covering his tracks, leading to a quicker investigation and capture. This speaks to Gacy's calculating and methodical nature, whereas Wilson seemed more impulsive, driven by short bursts of rage. The contrast in their personas also extends to how society perceived them. Gacy maintained a respectable front, involved in local politics, and was well liked in his community before his capture. His ability to mask his darkness under a friendly exterior added to the shock when his true nature was revealed. Wilson, however, never cultivated such an image, with his reputation marred by earlier signs of instability and violence. This difference in public perception made Gacy's eventual arrest more shocking, while Wilson's capture seemed inevitable based on his behavioral patterns. Despite their different approaches, both Gacy and Wilson left behind a trail of devastated families and communities. Gacy's crimes exposed the vulnerability of young men and the ease with which trust could be manipulated by predators in positions of power. Wilson's violent outbursts, on the other hand, highlighted the danger of unchecked mental health issues combined with a lack of societal support, showcasing the unpredictable nature of impulsive violence. Both killers demonstrated a complete lack of empathy toward their victims, though Gacy's manipulation skills allowed him to deceive not just his victims, but his entire community. Wilson's brutality was more transparent, making him a more obvious threat from the start. The stark contrast in their methodologies reveals how dangerous killers can emerge from vastly different psychological landscapes and societal roles, but still cause irreversible damage. Ultimately, the key difference between Gacy and Wilson lies in their premeditation and psychological manipulation. Gacy was a master of deception, hiding his true nature behind a carefully crafted facade. Wilson, in contrast, acted without such pretense, relying on brute force and immediate aggression. This difference not only shaped their crimes, but also their downfalls, with Gacy evading capture for years, while Wilson's violent tendencies led to a quicker arrest. In the midpoint comparison, Gacy's premeditation and public facade are evident. His ability to manipulate not only his victims, but also those around him allowed him to avoid capture for years. On the other hand, Wilson's impulsive nature and lack of control made his violence more transparent, leading to a quicker arrest. While Gacy used charm and deceit to lure his victims, Wilson relied on brute force. The contrast between their approaches underlines Gacy's more calculating sociopathy versus Wilson's emotional volatility. When comparing the psychological profiles of Wade Wilson and John Wayne Gacy, it becomes clear that their paths to becoming serial killers were driven by fundamentally different mental conditions. Gacy displayed classic traits of sociopathy, charm, manipulation, and a lack of remorse. His ability to seamlessly blend into society while carrying out heinous acts indicates a high level of control and planning, traits commonly associated with sociopathic behavior. Wilson, however, appears to fit more closely into a profile marked by impulse control disorders. His violent outbursts and lack of planning suggest a mind governed by momentary urges rather than long-term schemes. This distinction is crucial in understanding their motivations. Gacy's crimes were deliberate and organized, suggesting that his actions stemmed from a desire for control and domination over his victims, fitting the mold of a calculated predator. Wilson, on the other hand, was driven by rage and frustration, often reacting to immediate emotional triggers. The differences in their psychological conditions also extend to their interactions with others. Gacy thrived on manipulating people, whether it was his victims, the police, or his community. His charming and confident demeanor made him difficult to suspect, allowing him to lure victims without raising alarm. Wilson lacked this level of social manipulation. His interactions were more confrontational and aggressive, making him an easily identifiable threat. This lack of subtlety in Wilson's behavior contributed to his faster capture. While both men exhibited a profound lack of empathy, Gacy's ability to maintain long-term relationships and manipulate others for his gain points to a more insidious form of sociopathy. His actions were premeditated, often involving elaborate rituals that gave him a sense of power and control. Wilson, by contrast, seemed unable to maintain any form of stable relationship, with his erratic behavior alienating those around him. His lack of long-term planning and foresight indicates a mind consumed by immediate gratification and emotional outbursts, rather than the cold calculation seen in Gacy. Another key difference between the two lies in their treatment of their victims. Gacy's murders involved extensive physical and psychological torture, showcasing his need to dominate and dehumanize his victims before killing them. Wilson, on the other hand, was more direct in his violence, often acting out of immediate rage. His lack of ritualistic behavior indicates a psychological profile driven more by emotional instability than the desire for power and control that motivated Gacy. The trial and imprisonment of both men also offer insight into their psychological makeup. Gacy remained composed during his trial, often deflecting blame and displaying little emotion. This cold, detached demeanor is typical of sociopaths, who can compartmentalize their emotions and remain unaffected by the consequences of their actions. Wilson, by contrast, was more volatile during his trial, displaying signs of frustration and anger. His inability to control his emotions further supports the theory that his crimes were driven by impulse rather than premeditation. Despite these differences, both men shared certain traits commonly found in serial killers, such as a disregard for human life and a lack of remorse. However, Gacy's ability to mask his inner darkness with a socially acceptable exterior makes him a more dangerous figure in terms of long-term threat. Wilson, while equally deadly, lacked the social finesse to evade capture for as long, making him a less calculated but equally tragic figure in the world of serial crime. Ultimately, the comparison between Gacy and Wilson reveals two very different types of killers. Gacy's sociopathy allowed him to deceive and manipulate, hiding his true nature for years while committing horrendous crimes. Wilson's impulsivity, on the other hand, made him a more erratic and less predictable killer, driven by immediate urges rather than long-term planning. Both profiles highlight the complex psychological factors that drive individuals to commit such horrific acts, but their differences in behavior and motivation show the wide range of mental conditions that can lead to violence.
Okay, so get this right. We've got these two guys, and one, he's like the friendly face everyone knows, part of the community, the whole 9 yards. The other, total whirlwind of violence, completely different. But both, John Wayne Gacy and Wade Wilson, ended up committing, well, unspeakable acts. And that's what we're diving into, trying to understand the psychology, what makes these infamous killers tick. And we're not just, rehashing old news here. We've got expert analysis comparing and contrasting Gacy and Wilson, how they did it, their motives, their profiles, the whole shebang.
Right.
And honestly, what we found is fascinating, disturbing, no doubt. But it's a chance to get inside, see how these criminal minds work in totally different ways. So, got to start somewhere, right? Let's talk MOs, methods of operation. Because how these two went about their crimes, night and day, really. Gacy, this wasn't some, shattery figure.
No.
He was the opposite Mr. Community, the guy next door. Even dressed up as Pogo the Clown, can you believe that? For kids' parties. He used that trust he built up, that whole persona, to lure his victims in.
It's incredible.
Then you got Wilson, completely different story. We're talking impulsive, aggressive, like pure, almost animalistic violence. No charade, no hiding who he was.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? These contrasting approaches. It's a window into how different their minds work.
Yeah.
Gacy was playing the long game, all about the facade. Wilson, he was all about the moment, like a powder keg.
Yeah, like they're on opposite ends of the spectrum here, but both did these horrific things. How is that even possible?
Well, that's where the psychology comes in. Gacy, with his planning, the way he tricked people for years, that points to a calculated mind, almost predatory, It wasn't just about the killing, it was the control. Every detail, like he was a puppet master in this horrible game.
It's chilling, dairying bodies under his own house, the level of planning, keeping it all hidden. It's almost too much.
And that's why Gacy is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Because he breaks the mold, it makes you realize evil doesn't always look how you'd expect. He was hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, a wolf in sheep's clothing. With Wilson, it's like the violence was more explosive, like a pressure cooker letting go. Unpredictable in a way that Gacy wasn't.
Exactly. And that's key. Gacy's control versus Wilson's impulsiveness. That's what'll help us understand what drove them both. And that's what we're going to dig into as we go deeper.
So we're back, and man, this is heavy stuff. No getting around it. But remember, the goal here isn't to be shocked or grossed out. It's to understand, right?
Absolutely.
And for that, we got to go deeper than the headlines, really get into what made these guys tick. Starting with Gacy, cuz
Wow.
you hear master manipulator and you think, okay, is that real life or just movies? But Gacy, he's like, it jumped right out of the textbook sociopath.
And that term gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
What are we really talking about here?
So it's not just being a jerk, not even just cruel. We're talking about a pattern of behavior, and a big part of it is zero empathy. No conscience, basically. Breaking rules, hurting others, and not caring at all.
Like their moral compass is just gone.
Exactly. And here's the thing. It's hidden. They can be charming, likable even. Gacy, successful businessman, active in the community, the whole bit. It blows my mind. So that whole nice guy act, Pogo the Clown, it was an act, all to get what he wanted.
Sadly, yeah.
Yeah?
Calculated manipulation. And that need for control. That's huge GE in understanding Gacy's crimes.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about killing. It was about owning those people, like his own twisted game where he's always calling shots.
Which is just the opposite of Wilson, right? With him, it feels like lack of control is the problem. Like something just took over and he couldn't help himself.
That's a sharp insight, actually. Gacy, it was all planned, every step. Wilson, different story. This points to impulse control issues, maybe deeper mental health stuff we don't even know about.
So, not to downplay how awful it was, but Gacy planned it all out, while Wilson's was more like a reflex. A switch flipped, and that was it.
Exactly. Like, picture someone with zero temper control. No thinking about consequences, just pure reaction. And that's the key difference to keep in mind. Same horrific outcome, but the paths to get there could be more different.
Two sides of the same coin, kinda, both doing terrible things, but for totally different reasons. Gacy, in control, pulling strings. Wilson, almost controlled by his own emotions, you know?
Yeah, and it makes you think about the impact on the victims, right? How different would it have been facing one or the other?
Man, that's heavy. And we should talk about that, but let's take a second, process what we've got so far.
Yeah, it's a lot. And it's easy to get caught up in the killer's heads.
Right.
But we got to remember, the real tragedy here is the victims. Their lives, their families. Absolutely. And, you know, that's something I think about a lot. How those different ways of thinking, Gacy versus Wilson, probably changed how the experience felt for the victims too.
Man, it's awful to think about. But you're right. What do you mean, exactly?
Well, with Gacy, right. All that manipulation, the way it was so thought out.
Yeah.
That points to a level of like mental torture that goes way beyond the physical stuff. Imagine thinking you're safe, that you can trust this guy, and then
it all gets ripped away in the worst way possible.
Exactly. He got off on that power, the fear he created. It's part of the whole sociopath thing.
Whereas Wilson, awful as it was a different kind of awful.
I think so. With him, it was the randomness of it. 1 minute things are normal, the next explosion. You don't even have time to understand, to fight back. It's the chaos that gets you.
So their personalities, the control freak versus the powder keg, that dictated how they committed the crimes, and what the victims went through.
It's all connected. And that's why understanding this stuff matters, not just after the fact, but maybe preventing it in the future.
Yeah.
If we learn the signs.
Right, because there's no one-size-fits-all criminal mind, is there? It's all different based on life experiences, what's wrong in their heads. The more we get that, the better shot we have at stopping the next Gacy or Wilson before it happens.
Exactly. We can't erase evil, but we can try to understand it, shine a light on it. Maybe that's how we stop it from hurting more people.
Well said. Really makes you think. And on that note, folks, one last thought before we go. If figuring out these minds, even the darkest ones out there, if that stopped just one of these things from happening, wouldn't it be worth it? Something to chew on. Until next time, stay curious, but stay safe out there.
By the end, it's clear that while both men shared a lack of empathy for their victims, their psychological profiles set them apart. Gacy's ability to charm and control, paired with his methodical planning, contrasts sharply with Wilson's impulsive and rage-driven actions. While both were killers, Gacy's long-standing manipulation of his community marked him as a more insidious threat. Wilson, although equally dangerous, was less deceptive and more easily identified as a menace. Their cases offer insight into different types of criminal pathology and violence,